and welcome everybody. And today I'm very pleased to introduce, I was going to say well-renowned, and I think that always sounds a bit dodgy when one says well-renowned, but a well-renowned conversations expert called Rob Kendall. Now, Rob's worked with many companies, around 75 large companies all over the world. And Rob, in fact, whenever I try and speak to you, you're flying somewhere or you're off somewhere. But today I'm very pleased. We're going to be centering around, I would say his new book, but actually it's not a new book. It's a book that was originally published almost 10 years ago called Blame Storming, which has now been revamped to be called Watch Your Language. And Rob was approached by his publisher, Watkins, to update it. And it's quite interesting that in 10 years, and I think as we can probably all imagine, how language and conversation has really changed in those years and how we view things. So we're going to concentrate on a number of areas, but the book, I have to say, I mean, I really enjoyed it. I actually smiled, Rob, all the way through because I kept thinking, oh God, I do that. Oh, I do that. I'm guilty of that. And you can just see yourself in it. And it's what we're going to discuss is how we get ourselves into messes, and Rob's going to help us to say, well, how we don't get ourselves into those messes, trying to identify or what the warning signs are, what people are trying to say to you. They may say one thing, and in fact, they're actually saying something completely different. And the one thing that made me laugh, and I think everybody identifies, is when people say sorry. They say sorry, and then they go on to show that they're absolutely not sorry for what they might have said. I thought, oh my God, we all know those people. They say sorry, and they just say, I'm sorry, but. And it was, I found that amusing. So anyway, welcome, Rob. Nice to introduce you today.
Well, thank you very much. What a wonderful introduction. So I'm delighted to be here with you. I think you summarized it extremely well.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. And then every sort of chapter that, I went through, I kept thinking, gosh, yeah, no, I get that. I think everyone can understand it. But it's really nice because sometimes you need to have the obvious pointed out to you. And I think we can all see what we've done, and we've all guilty of have gone down those roads, those traps.
I think that's absolutely right. And actually, conversation is quite a difficult territory to navigate because it all happens so quickly. And for the most part, we don't have a written record of what we just said a minute ago. So it's quite hard to go back over it because even a couple of minutes later, we have a somewhat vague recollection of what exactly it was that you said or what exactly I said in response to that. So sometimes it's quite hard to learn from. So one of the things I wanted to do with Watch Your Language is help people navigate through those conversations. And I think it's that process of self-awareness that you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, where you can see in the moment what it is that you're doing, and then you have a choice about how you respond next. And the more we're able to do that, the more effective our conversations become.
And I think it's very much about interpretation. Excuse me, I've got a dreadful cough at the moment, so let's hope I don't cough all the way through. So it is, I think you're right, we don't have that recording, and you've always got that person who always says to you, well, you said this and you said that, and it's like, well, do we really know that was actually said? But today, the 4 areas that we've, or Robbers would like for us to discuss, and actually discuss is going to be the word, because Rob has said that he feels that today would be better for us to discuss what we're going to talk about in a conversation as opposed to just more of the expert that we normally have to impart their wisdom. But I must say that I have no wisdom to impart, by the way, Rob, as you may already know. So we're going to look at how communication works and how communication works relevant to our membership at talkhealth is wellbeing, how we discuss things about our health. Then we're going to look at fixing problems, or rather, how do we stop trying to fix people's problems, which I think is very pertinent. We're going to have a very important conversation about mental health and how we can prevent, one hopes, a lot of issues developing. And the last thing that we're going to look at, and I think is a really important thing, is arguments. How do we, prevent ourselves going down a path that we quite often didn't expect to go down, but we end up having that argument. So So if you'd like to start, Rob, by kicking off, talking to us about our communicating and our own well-being.
Well, I think, you only have to look in your own experience to see that, for instance, when we have a really good conversation with somebody else, and sometimes an amazing conversation with somebody else, what that does for our sense of connection and our sense of affinity with them. And actually, even in certain situations, our love for them. So when our communication is great, we just feel totally attuned to them. The other side of that coin is when a conversation goes badly. And it's amazing, isn't it, that we can have somebody that we deeply love, and yet we can have a conversation that goes badly, and then suddenly there's this sort of chasm between us, even if it's temporary. It's this sense of separation and a lack of affinity between us. We feel like we occupy different worlds for a moment, until we can come back together effectively again. And of course, the relationship between that and well-being is huge. And I think in a professional context as well, the same is true. People often say that the most stressful part of their day is their manager or their boss. And that has a lot to do with the way that they communicate together. So, for example, when that relationship is strong, people feel less burnt out, they have less days off sick, their whole sense of well-being is greater. And actually, one of the stories I often quote is back in the 80s, John Gottman, who's one of the leading experts on relationships, marriage, and his colleague Bob Levinson. They were working at the University of Washington as professors there. And what they did is they set up a thing called a love lab. And the love lab was something where couples would come in and they would observe them and monitor them. And they would particularly monitor them talking about something that was challenging or a point of disagreement in their relationship. And what they found was that simply by observing them together for a very short space of time, they could predict with more than 90% accuracy whether that couple would be together 5 years, 10 years down the line. And these were longitudinal studies that were done over a huge period of time. And really what they were saying is they could tell just by the quality of the interaction whether those couples would kind of spiral into that kind of process of coming apart and separating and their relationship ultimately failing, or whether they actually would continue to grow and develop together. So I think it's well proven over the years, over the decades, the relationship between communication, productivity, the quality of our relationships, but also our well-being as well.
Yes, definitely. And I think, our well-being is very much based on, as you said, our interaction with other people.
Well, I would see it as the lifeblood of our relationships. And I mean, Katrina, you were saying to me that you used to run a very successful consulting company with offices around the world and so on. And I would bet that from the moment you woke up in the morning and started work to the moment where you switched off at the end of the day, that you spent your day communicating with people. So it might have been face-to-face, might have been email, might have been text, might have been in meetings together. But really, that was all getting developed and delivered, and your business was grown through interactions with other people. And so I think, the same is true if you think about our day. I know it varies depending upon what profession you're in, but for most of us, our day is made up of conversations, and our quality of our interactions determines the quality of our relationships.
Yeah, I mean, totally. And I, in my previous life, as you mentioned, I always tried to have an open door policy and wanted people to say, especially if you are somebody's boss, manager, or whatever, I would always say to people, I am not a mind reader. So if you've got a problem, you have to come and tell me. And, because I remember when I first started working, you kind of expect your manager to understand everything that's going on in your life. And, as a manager, you don't, you're far too busy. And so, I always used to say, there were two things I always used to say, come and tell me your problems. You know, I'm always here, and hopefully if it's a work problem, I can sort it for you, or I can work with you to work it out. And the other thing was very much around the communication with emails, is that if what you're saying to somebody via an email, they can't understand it within 2 emails, pick the phone up, because otherwise you end up writing things you don't want. You've then, you know, we're talking about having evidence. You've then got a paper trail of people say, well, you wrote this and you wrote that. And it, you know, how we interpret things, especially if they're written, can get so distorted.
It's absolutely right. And of course, written communication doesn't have tone, or at least the tone is assumed. It doesn't have inference. It doesn't have all that richness in the subtext of it that we have in face-to-face communication. And I think that's one of the difficulties we face in our new world. But I think the other thing you said was, often we see conversation as mainly about the speaking side of things. And in my mind, it's at least equally, if not more so, about the listening side of things. And I think to your point earlier about people coming to you, they would only do that if they had an experience that they would feel heard. And I would bet that all of us in our own life know who we would go to when we've got a concern or a challenge or a problem, because we have the experience that we'd be known and we'd be heard, and that we wouldn't be judged and criticized by those people. And equally, we know exactly who the people are that we wouldn't go to in those situations, whether that be in a personal or professional context. And I think that's to do with the quality of the listening that the people around us provide.
And I suppose that actually goes on to the conversation that we were going to, well, the next point we were going to talk about was about fixing problems. Now, I've just said I'll tell people to come and tell me if they've got a problem and I'll help them fix it. But there is the flip side to that, fixing problems as well, isn't there?
Well, absolutely right. And I think we're all, in a way, addicted fixers. I can certainly count myself as one of those. I think naturally we think when somebody comes to us with a problem or a challenge, often it feels like our whole sense of worth and value is tied up in, I need to be able to come up with a solution to your problem. And yet I think actually often the opposite is true. I think the real thing is, can we create a space in which people can feel heard, and then can we help them solve their own problems? So, you know, if you were providing that for me and I came to you and I said, okay, Katrina, I've got this challenge or this issue. The problem is if you try and solve my problem, that's your solution rather than mine. And yet, if you just created some space for me and you really listened, I would probably say, well, the thing is, this is the problem. And then a minute later, I'd say, actually, now I've heard myself say that, it probably isn't quite that. It's probably this instead. And then I would say, oh, well, actually, that's quite interesting because I hadn't really thought of it that way before. And effectively, I would take myself from the beginning of that conversation to a solution where potentially you've done very little other than be there, but perhaps ask me a few really thoughtful questions that allowed me to kind of think about what I was saying and to guide me through that. For example, you might say to me, well, given what you said, what do you think is needed? And then I would go, okay, well, that's an interesting question, because to be able to answer that question, I've got to think about what's important to me, and I've got to think about my values to answer the question regarding what's needed. And I wouldn't ask myself that question in my own mind, but if you asked it to me, it would give me a little bit of a space to think. Or you might say, well, how do you feel about that? And I might say, well, actually, I feel quite cross about it. And then I might say, well, actually, I also feel quite guilty or whatever. And then I would go, actually, I didn't realize that I felt that. And so there's this whole process of exploration that comes out of you doing little more than creating some space for me and being there for me, and then asking some powerful questions. And I think often the people that we go to again and again, that's exactly what they provide for us.
And I think it's also quite often, you think that you think about a problem, but when somebody does ask you a question, you suddenly hear it coming out of your voice. You start forming it in sentences, and you realize that actually perhaps you haven't looked at it in a fully rounded way at all. And as you said, it gives you things. But funny enough, going back to my previous life as a management consultant, I mean, that's exactly what consultants do. They go to their customer, they ask them what the problem is. They spend a lot of time and customers' money saying, well, tell me about your problem. How would you fix it? And actually, the consultants aren't doing anything other than just forming a good all-rounded opinion from everybody, what the issues are and how to solve it. Because the solving has to be within that person or that company. It's not the external person, because as the external person, you can't understand every sort of the minutiae of the detail that's involved.
It's absolutely right. And I think also it speaks to the point that there's so many different kinds of conversations, aren't there? There are conversations where we're stuck and we're challenged, but also, for instance, in a professional context, there are conversations where we're trying to create and invent the future together. We're trying to create new opportunities. There are conversations where we're giving each other feedback and input and so on. And I think that different kinds of conversations have different kind of rules to them. And again, that's one of the things I'm trying to do in Watch Your Language is equip people to be able to navigate different kind of conversations and have a set of tools for be able to navigate your way through those conversations. And as you rightly say, when it comes to that whole thing around listening and asking questions, there's something about hearing myself think, and a problem occurs differently in my own head than when I try and articulate it. So that allows us to see it in a new way. If only somebody could help us and kind of facilitate our process of getting clear.
Absolutely. And then, I mean, then, it's amazing, isn't it? Because, we have some points that we said that we're going to discuss and how everything flows in, because I want to now ask you about mental health, which is very much about, understanding and hearing people speak, and giving people the opportunity to discuss something before it goes from being at the stage, 1 problem to a stage 10 problem, for example.
Totally right. And it might be worth just going back and just telling a moment about my own story, because I grew up in a very loving family. My parents, everyone would refer to them as saints, and I would agree with that wholeheartedly. They were just extraordinary human beings. But I guess they were also a product of their generation, and in that generation, we didn't really talk about things a whole lot. And certainly my experience of growing up, I grew up in a military family, so I moved home 14 times in 20 years. I'd lived on 4 continents by the time I was a teenager. And of course, then as a product of that, I had to be at boarding school. And I, from the age of 8, would get dropped off at boarding school, and my dad would shake my hand and sort of say, "See you at Christmas." And I learned very, very quickly that I had to, when I had problems or I was homesick or I was struggling, I had to be very self-reliant and just basically deal with those on my own. I wouldn't dream of going home to my family and saying I'm struggling, or going to a friend of mine or a teacher and saying the same. And I think that whole process of trying to deal with things on your own sort of in a way, it made me very resilient, but I started to see the flaws and the downsides of it as I grew older. And one of the things I talk about in the book was actually by this point I was an adult, and realizing that my grandmother had taken her own life through suicide. And I really only found out about it. My parents had to tell me because it was in all the newspapers. But she'd been struggling with depression after the death of my grandfather for a whole number of years. And it had really been like a secret in the family. It was a badge of shame to be struggling in terms of your mental health. And as a product of that, she really didn't get the support that she needed. And, you know, I spent a whole summer with her before I died, living with her and working, and I was oblivious to the kind of difficulties that she was going through. And I think for me, that was the turning point really in my own journey around wanting my life to be focused on communication and the power of conversation. And I think we're just getting to the point now, but only in the recent number of years, where we're trying to have a new relationship to mental health, where people can say, I'm struggling, where it's okay to say, I'm not okay, where somebody can go to a family member or a colleague at work or their manager or whatever and say, I'm really not in good shape at the moment. And again, one of the things I mentioned in my book, and this is much more recent, it was only January this year, was the death of my sister as well, to suicide. And just been a shocking experience for me, and just incredibly difficult and distressing experience over the last 18 months, seeing her mental health decline. And I think your point is absolutely right, which is around early support and early prevention, rather than getting to the point where we're in crisis. And then the whole thing becomes much, much more difficult. And, you know, it so reinforced my desire to sort of spend the remaining section of my working life really supporting effective mental health conversations. And I think that starts with, one, people feeling that it's safe with the people around them, again, for all the reasons we said, of feeling heard, to be able to say, I'm really not in good shape, but also having people around us who can listen in the right way without necessarily having to be mental health experts, but can really listen in the right way and be able to guide us to support. And I think when you look at the statistics on stress in the UK today, 39% of all the people signed off work are signed off with stress. When you think of the difficulties and the challenges that we face in our modern world with regards to our mental health, you know, we know this is a serious problem that we're dealing with. And I think being able to have those early conversations where we can say that we're struggling is so, so important.
You know, and, you know, obviously it's so sad about the fact, you know, with your grandmother and your sister, and I'm so sorry to hear that. But how do you think, is it because it's clear, particularly with your grandmother, you know, as you said, you spent the summer with her before and you didn't see, I mean, maybe had you have known, you might have seen the signs. So it's really hard, isn't it? Is it more, as close members, we should be more aware of the signs, or is it more that the onus has got to be on that person, that they feel that they can talk to somebody? You know, it's like, or is it a question of both?
I think it's a question of both. You know, there's a whole term that has really sort of developed in a wonderful way and is blossoming, which is around psychological safety. And I think that comes back to this idea that, you know, in your life who you would talk to and who you wouldn't talk to. And we need to have safe places, don't we? We need to have safe places, people who we feel are safe, where we can be ourselves with. And I think so often we feel the pressure to be able to say that we're doing fine, that we're flourishing, that we're great. You know, I remember one of my daughters saying, just grown-up daughters, saying recently that, you know, she had spent the whole afternoon with a wonderful friend of hers, with her friend in tears, you know, really distraught about the state of her life and feeling lonely and feeling nothing was working for her, and then seeing a post on Instagram that evening talking about how wonderful her life was. her life is. And you know, I think it's that pressure, isn't it, to and I think social media often doesn't help this, but that pressure to be able to put forward a front, to put on a good show. And I think actually the reality is that a lot of people are not necessarily, you know, struggling deeply, but a lot of people are coping with a lot of things in their life and a lot of challenges in their life. And ultimately, we want to have environments around us where, yes, to your point, we feel personally that we can go and say to people, this is how I'm really feeling, this is what I'm dealing with. But the other side of that is true, is that can we be somewhat more attuned to how people are doing, because people's language, people's behavior doesn't lie often, and often behind what they say, when we can learn to listen in that way, we can be more attuned to, actually, this person doesn't seem in such good shape. And then I think are the ways to be able to broach those conversations and say, Katrina, you seem, you know, more worried, vexed, anxious. Is that just me? Have I just made that up? Or you know, how are things for you? You know, how are you finding things at the moment? And either in the capacity of being a family member or a good friend, or even in a professional context, being a colleague, I think there are ways to be able to broach those conversations, or to be able to go to somebody that's more expert than us, and to say to them, could you just maybe have a word and find out how they're doing? So I think, you know, the onus, I believe, is on both sides.
And you know, I'm a great believer in talking, and obviously it would appear that women seem to be much better in the sense that they're far more chatty with their girlfriends, you know, and girls it's quite easy to moan about things, to get it off your chest. And I'm a great believer in that. Getting it off your chest allows you to move on, and that's cool. That's where you nip problems in the bud, because you've got it off your chest to start with, as opposed to brooding on it and building things up more and turning them into things that maybe they weren't there to, you know. So it's like a little acorn and it gets bigger and bigger. And, you know, being able to get it off your chest, I think, is really important.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And, you know, I work, for instance, in the construction industry a lot. It's very male oriented. The suicide rate is 3 times the national average. And I think a lot of that is men feeling they're often working away from home. But I think there is sort of an old thing of men not wanting to feel that they're weak. But the only thing I would say is that's not exclusive to men. And I think it does go both ways. And of course, with my sister Nemi, you know, and I've included a whole chapter in my book around mental health conversations, because I feel it's so important. And just seeing that, you know, her go through that process of decline in terms of her mental health and not getting the support that she needed was really a tragic process.
And I think that, I mean, that is really the very difficult problem, isn't it? Is when we've identified, you know, lots of people identify there's a problem. They know you know, the family know they need help. They know they need help. But because of our resources are so stretched, it's just not possible to get the help. And I think that must be a very, very difficult position to be in, as you said.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think yes, with it, you know, we've just been through an inquest, and I think what came through from that loud and clear is often the services that we would want and hope and expect aren't always there. People are so stretched in terms of being able to provide that resource. We would hope it would always be there for us, but I think there's a lot in the immediate term that we as friends, family members, partners can also provide, exactly as you describe at the early point in that process, to be able to provide people with emotional support, and also to be able to direct them towards more expert guidance and help.
Absolutely. And you know, and then that neatly goes on to our last point that we were going to talk about, is arguments. And, you know, a lot of those things can start off, or where we're feeling bad because we've had an argument with somebody, we've misunderstood properly, or we've stopped the argument without having worked our way through the issues. And I'd be very interested in your take of, you know, how do we prevent arguments? Is it possible to prevent arguments?
Well, yes, 2 things. I mean, I think one is it's part and parcel of any relationship, isn't it? Is the ability to be able to because disagreements are going to happen. I don't think
Mm.
anyone would say, that is part of a healthy relationship, is be able to have disagreements. But I think sometimes those, particularly when they're repeated, can become more destructive arguments.
Mm.
I mean, I've been married for more than 30 years, and I remember when my children were little, if Sally and I had an argument, we would say, okay, we need to go and talk about this. Afterwards, we would sit down
Yeah.
and talk. I remember one of my children sort of, poking their head around the door and saying, does this, Mum and Dad, does this mean you're going to divorce? And I remember saying, no, this is marriage. This is what marriage looks like, which is that ability and that commitment to be able to stay in communication. And I think the difficulty is where disagreements become repeated and where they also start to become damaging. And one of the things I try and do in Watch Your Language is sort of dismantle the process of arguments so that we have more awareness of what happens as we go through them. Effectively, they sort of go through different stages. So, for example, are these two characters in the book, Beth and Dan, and they're very committed to each other, but they have this argument where they both work very hard. Beth goes home before Dan at the end of the day, and she picks up some food and cooks some food for Dan, and then she gets a text from Dan saying, I'm sorry, I'm a bit late, I got held up at work. And when he finally gets home, actually she's made dinner, it's got cold. She's already upset with him, and then it turns out that he's had a beer at the pub on his way home with his brother Ethan, and then conversation sort of goes from nothing to 100 in about a minute, because it sort of slides into, well, hang on a minute, I thought you said that you were at work, and then instead of just listening and Dan saying, listen, I'm really sorry, I really apologize, I should have let you know, and I should have texted you, and so on, he then tries to justify himself and says, well, Ethan's having a hard time, and it was only a lightning pint, and tries to sort of cover his tracks. And of course, then that makes her more upset about the fact that actually he lied to her. And then he tries to sort of dig in further, and he says, listen, Beth, I haven't slept with anyone, I've just had a beer. And then of course she says, Dad, it's not about the beer. It's about the fact that you lied to me. And then of course he makes it worse, because he makes a comparison, and he says, I bet my brother Ethan doesn't get this kind of grief when he goes home where that happens. And it's understanding that those conversations go through stages. I use the analogy of the Apollo rocket and the moon landing, because it goes through various stages of liftoff. And arguments go through the same process, that they might start with an innocuous comment, which effectively becomes a trigger. And then what happens is that provokes an emotional reaction, which immediately puts us, either on the attack or on the defensive. And then when the other person does that, we immediately match it and do the same thing. And suddenly, instead of being in a conversation together, we're in opposition with each other. And as soon as that happens, then our language then follows that, and the intensity of the conversation tends to increase. So that's where we start saying, well, you always do this and you never do that. And then of course we take offense, because we say, well, that's totally untrue that I always or I never do that. The best way to provoke an argument is say you always or you never. And then potentially we throw in comparisons where we say, well, they don't do that, or whatever it is. And in those situations, it's like we literally lose sight of our values and our commitments. We lose sight of the fact that we deeply love this person, and yet we get locked in this battle of righteousness with each other, where everything becomes about me winning the argument. And a lot of that is also actually to do with the physiology of stress, that when the stress response is activated, we become, our way of thinking becomes very narrow, and effectively we get locked in on one thing, which is about, actually my job is to win this argument. And then of course our emotions rise, and because we don't feel heard, they get blocked. And when they get blocked, then the intensity of the conversation again increases. And when you can start to see that happening in a conversation as it's going on, then actually it becomes harder to have arguments, damaging arguments in that way, because you know what you're doing. And what I try and do in the book is also give people strategies for dealing with those. So, of course, one of the obvious ones is, I call it press the pause button. Just step back a minute from the intensity of the conversation. And as soon as you do that, actually it allows your prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, to sort of get engaged. And it gives you a little bit more perspective on the conversation. And then we can return to it, even if it's a couple of minutes later, we can return to it in a way that's more moderated and in a way that has brings our values a little bit more into the equation. So yeah, you know, those times you look back on an argument and you just think that was ridiculous. You know, how do we get into that conversation? And I think what I try and do is sort of lift the bonnet and understand what's going on in the engine there with regards to arguments, so that we have more say and control over the way that they go.
So it's really for both parties, really, or one realizes it's getting out of hand. So in your book, do you have strategies for both people as to, okay, how do we pause this? And I suppose, you know, the other thing is, what do you do? Because I'm sure people have, they'll start arguing about something, but more often than not, it's an underlying argument that's been going on for a long time. How would you suggest to people to start trying to sort out that argument? You know, what's, the issue behind it all?
Yes, quite. I mean, I write a chapter about this as well, which is about understanding the subtext.
Yeah.
There's often a subtext. And I use this silly example. Sally and I, going back years, when we had a friend with us, and I was making a soup, and we ended up having this conversation about which soup we were going to cook. And about halfway through this conversation, our friend stopped us and said, "You do realize it's not about the soup." This conversation is not about the soup. And then afterwards we sort of went, completely stopped us in our tracks. And of course it wasn't, it was about something else. And I think often we use a conversation as a sort of a shield for the conversation that really needs to be had. And I guess there are some things, again, that can help us in the moment, which are about stepping away from the intensity of it, because when we've got that strong emotion is sometimes the worst time to be able to have that conversation. And actually there's a point where you can give yourself a little bit of distance, come back to it, and then say, okay, let's talk together, but let's set the ground rules for how we're going to have this conversation, which is, I'm not going to interrupt you. I'm really going to try and make an effort to hear you out, listen fully, and understand the context and the emotion and the subtext behind that, and allow that to get heard. And conversation has a magic way when we do that, where issues just literally disappear. It's like seeing water drain out of a sink. And suddenly we feel returned to ourselves, and our sense of affinity gets restored with the other person. And then we can have a different kind of conversation around how we prevent that from happening next time, or what we could have done differently for another time. But always it requires, in the first instance, having a mechanism for that kind of emotion to be able to dissipate and to some extent drain away, so that we can have the conversation we really want to have. So you're absolutely right. Huge part of effective interactions is not what we say, but what we don't say, and what we mean, but don't say. So a lot of the action is going on in the subtext.
And I think also it is a brave step to say to your partner, because we all have in our own, if we're going to have a conversation, we run that conversation in our own head as to who's going to say what, and you're always ready for your partner to come up with his normal line or whatever it might be, and you're ready to jump in, and it is very easy to think, oh God, do I really want to go down this again? And I think what you were saying in your book is that this business about pausing, because if you're learning to try to, because what you're learning to do is try to have a different type of conversation. So you're not going to get that spot on to start with. And it's a question, and I think what I liked about your book was what you've got to practice. It's not going to suddenly become, straight away how to do this properly, because it is very complex for all the different layers that we're all so different. And one minute we may think one thing, but the next minute we do all change our mind because we're seeing it from another perspective. And I think that was really nice, is that you give everybody a break to say, you're not going to get it right straight away. In fact, you may never get it right, but you can keep trying and getting closer to some understanding between each other.
Well, it's an absolutely beautiful summary. Absolutely right. My core view is that conversation communication is a skill, and we pick it up informally based on the people around us. But given it's one of the most important things we'll ever learn, actually there are some rules and practices and distinctions in this whole field that if we take those on and then we practice and practice and practice, we become more and more effective. And I think in that way, our relationships, and this isn't just personal relationships, it's friendships, or it's in a work context as well, I think our relationships can become more and more resilient, because we know that it's not that we won't have difficult conversations, and it's not that things won't go wrong, but I think it's having that confidence that actually in those situations we've got the tools that we need to be able to work our way out of them. And I refer to these 4 situations in the book because part of it is trying to create some language around it. So one of them, for instance, is the tangle, where there's sort of mixed messages, and another is the big argument, and another is the bad place. And for instance, there's a difference between the big argument and the bad place, because the big argument is sort of that process of escalation, and the bad place is where you get left after that conversation. And I think when people can identify and say, oh, I understand where I'm at the moment, and I've got some tools to be able to help me out of this, then I think life and relationships become much, much easier to be able to navigate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we should all get practicing. And so just to remember, to mention your book again, What's Your Language? I would really recommend it. It's a really interesting read, and you think, oh, this is quite enjoyable to understand these issues. I can identify with it, but it does sort of catch you, and you think, gosh, yeah, you're right. I could have done that so much. I could have handled something so much better, that everybody came out of the conversation feeling good about themselves as opposed to negative. So thank you very much for your time today, Rob. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much, Katrina.
Bye, everyone.